I'm Ben Meiselas from the MeidasTouch Network. Donald Trump's former lawyer and current co-defendant in the Fulton County RICO case, John Eastman, is not just a crook, but he's also incredibly dumb. It's shocking to me that he was a law professor in Southern California who taught constitutional law. Well, John Eastman is currently embroiled in a state bar proceeding to revoke his legal license, and in that proceeding, he is either intentionally or inadvertently throwing Donald Trump under the bus by invoking a privilege in a matter over his fitness to practice law that John Eastman isn't even the privilege holder. And by invoking this privilege, he is now embroiling Donald Trump in more criminal liability. Let me just break down what is taking place. And by the way, I'm very confident that ultimately the state bar is going to make an order revoking John Eastman's legal license. He is an absolute freaking menace to the legal profession, a disgrace to the legal profession. But John Eastman is not invoking his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, so he's testifying in the state bar proceeding. He tried to seek a delay after the Fulton County District Attorney indictment, and even before that when he was identified as an unindicted co-conspirator in Special Counsel Jack Smith's prosecution in Washington, D.C. for Donald Trump's attempt to overthrow our democracy. So Eastman tried to beg the court, please delay this indefinitely. And the court's like, you've testified before. You knew about your potential criminal exposure before. It's too late to try to delay this and to let this drag on. And because of the seriousness of the allegations, this court is not going to delay or stay the proceedings. So now John Eastman is testifying. He's testified for several hours. Sometimes to some of the questions, he's not answering it, and he's invoking attorney-client privilege, purportedly his attorney-client privilege with Donald Trump. The lawyer doesn't hold the privilege. The client holds the privilege. And so that means that Donald Trump would be the one who has to ask John Eastman to assert the privilege on certain questions. Let me tell you the question that John Eastman asserted attorney-client privilege on that I think is actually very incriminating to Donald Trump, and I'll explain why. Do you remember the day before the January 6th insurrection where Chuck Grassley, the Senate pro temp MAGA Republican from Iowa, suggested that he was going to be the person presiding over the counting of the electoral votes? The Iowa Capitol Dispatch reported that there was a great deal of confusion because Chuck Grassley also stated that he did not expect Vice President Pence, now former Vice President Pence, to be present on January 6th. Now, this probably gives a whole new meaning and understanding, rather, to when Secret Service agents loyal to Donald Trump were telling Pence to leave and they wanted Pence to go with them. Pence not being there to count the electoral votes. Was Chuck Grassley going to count the electoral votes and then make the unilateral decision to say that Donald Trump won? Why would Chuck Grassley even be involved in this? Because as the Senate pro temp, he would be next in line to count the electoral votes if the vice president is not present. And then so Chuck Grassley made those statements. Then there was like, what are you talking about, Grassley? Pence isn't showing what's going on. And then Grassley said, oh, no. You know, I misspoke. I was misquoted. So why am I telling you about Chuck Grassley? Because that was one of the many questions that John Eastman was asked about. Hey, did you have any communications with Donald Trump or with Chuck Grassley about him filling in instead of Pence, and for Grassley to count and Grassley to do whatever he was going to do differently than Pence? So what did John Eastman answer? I invoke not the Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. He said, I invoke attorney-client privilege. And then the state bar prosecutor said, okay, well, who's the privilege holder that you are invoking the privilege for? And then John Eastman said, I'm invoking it on behalf of Donald Trump. So in other words, based on him invoking the privilege, what is he saying? That he believes there were attorney-client confidential communications between him and Donald Trump on the topic of Chuck Grassley filling in for former Vice President Pence, then Vice President Pence, and that Grassley was going to take over the role to count electoral votes. By asserting attorney-client privilege, that's what Eastman is saying, and he's saying, I'm refusing to answer because of the privilege assertion. Now, that doesn't sound like a valid privilege assertion for a number of reasons. One, that privilege assertion has to be made by Trump, not by Eastman. That's number one. So if he's purporting that Donald Trump made it. But two, then that would seem to be, again, fall under the crime fraud exception, that they are engaged in purported attorney-client communications, which actually aren't, to commit a crime of overthrowing our democracy. You'll recall a federal judge in Southern California, in the Central District of California's Southern Division, Judge David Carter, previously ruled that Eastman and Trump were engaged in a coup in search of a legal theory and that there was not the provision of legitimate legal advice. So Judge Carter ordered that communications be turned over to the January 6th committee as a result, and we've gotten some significant documents because of that. So do I think, though, that the state bar is going to seek, with respect to this proceeding, the crime fraud exception to apply? I don't, because it is an admission of John Eastman's unfitness to practice law in the first place, to remove his license, because that's what the proceeding is about, for Eastman to be declaring a privilege that he doesn't hold, but then even asserting it to refuse to answer a question about whether Chuck Grassley, the MAGA Republican senator from Iowa, was going to be used instead of Pence, and Pence wasn't going to show up. Folks, we should be paying attention to what's going on in the state bar proceeding, because it is a rare insight into what it is that these MAGA Republicans are going to be claiming in these other proceedings as well. Because remember, Eastman's a co-defendant in the RICO case in Fulton County, and the stuff that he's saying is just some of the most preposterous, bogus stuff. Like, he claims that he doesn't really have a big role and that he didn't really spread any lies and conspiracies or anything like that. We have a videotape of you, John Eastman. Do you remember this? This is John Eastman giving a speech on the Ellipse on January 6th, spreading all of these deranged conspiracies. Here, play this clip.
We know there was fraud, traditional fraud that occurred. We know that dead people voted. But we now know, because we caught it live last time in real time, how the machines contributed to that fraud. And let me, as simply as I can, explain it. You know, the old way was to have a bunch of ballots sitting in a box under the floor, and when you needed more, you pulled them out in the dark of night. They put those ballots in a secret folder in the machines, sitting there waiting until they know how many they need. And then the machine, after the close of polls, we now know who's voted and we know who hasn't. And I can now, in that machine, match those unvoted ballots with an unvoted voter and put them together in the machine. And
then there's John Eastman standing right next to Rudy Giuliani when Giuliani said, let's have trial by combat. Play the clip.
But if we're right, a lot of them will go to jail. So let's have trial by combat.
And by the way, the questioning over Chuck Grassley, this is the same Chuck Grassley who recently said Chuck Grassley was the one who made up that there were 17, well, him and the other MAGA Republicans, that there were 17 audio recordings of Joe Biden engaged in bribes, like just totally false, like that didn't exist. Just making that up. And then he went on Fox and said, we are not interested in whether the allegations are accurate or not. You don't believe me? Here, play the clip.
And we aren't interested in whether or not the accusations against Vice President Biden are accurate or not. We're responsible for making sure the FBI does its job, and that's what we want to know.
Okay, Senator, let me stop you there. You just said you read the document, is that right?
Yes.
Then what did it say?
Well, I'm not going to characterize it.
So, folks, you have John Eastman testifying in a state bar proceeding saying that he can't discuss matters about whether the guy you just saw, MAGA Republican Chuck Grassley, was being asked to take over for Pence. Eastman says he can't answer that because he believes that him and Trump were having attorney-client communications over that. That's what he's saying. Folks, it's right there in front of us. We just got to be focused on the evidence, the facts, the testimony of what's going on. Hey, have you checked out our new Patreon? patreon.com/MeidasTouch. Check it out. Wherever you get audio podcasts, subscribe to the MeidasTouch podcast as well. Have a great day.
Hey, Meidas Mighty. Love this report? Continue the conversation by following us on Instagram @MeidasTouch to keep up with the most important news of the day. What are you waiting for? Follow us now.